Road trips used to be one of my favorite ways to spend my weekends off. I used to just drive until I found some place that seemed interesting and then I would stop in to check it out. Sometimes I would get a motel room while I was on the road, and others I would just sleep in my car. But as long as I was out doing things on my time off, I was happy. That all changed though when I decided to take a trip down south to visit a museum that focused on the history of music. The trip to the museum was great. I loved all the sights from the highway that I got to take in, and the hotel that I stayed at in town that night was actually really nice for the price I paid for it. It was the trip back that became a nightmare. You see, it was about a 9-hour drive from the hotel back to my house, and my plan was to simply drive throughout the entire night so that I could make it home early in the morning to get ready for work the next day. I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to make the entire 9 hours, but I have to admit, it started off pretty well. I managed to drive until about 2 in the morning before I had to make my first stop. I had to use the restroom, so I made sure to keep my eye open for any signs of a rest area, and luckily for me, there was one coming up right after the next exit. I drove down the highway until I finally saw the off-ramp that led to the rest area, which was surprisingly empty. There was only one other car in the parking lot, and as I parked, I noticed that it seemed like no one was inside of it. I quickly checked my phone after parking and messaged my mom to let her know that I was still driving but should be home by the morning, and then I locked the doors and headed toward the men's room. I stepped inside and noticed that there was someone in there already. I assumed it was the owner of the other car in the parking lot. It's awkward to spark up any sort of conversation in the restroom, so I just planned on ignoring him and going about my business, when out of nowhere I heard a voice say, "Excuse me." I turned behind me and noticed that there was a second man in the bathroom who was now standing between me and the door to leave. I asked him if I could help him with anything, and that was when he told me that he needed a couple of things from me. I was curious to hear what he wanted, but that was when he started rattling off a list of my personal possessions, like my phone, my wallet, and my car keys. At first, I tried to laugh it off as if it was some sort of bad joke, but that was when I felt something sharp start pressing into my side. The man that I had first noticed in the bathroom was now standing right up against me with something pressed against my ribs. I tried to stay calm as I looked around, hoping that there was a way out of that situation, but I couldn't think of anything. And when I didn't respond right away by giving them my things, I'll never forget the pain that I felt as the man slowly started to press harder and harder. I could feel the pressure from the point of the blade getting ready to rip into me as I yelled out, "Okay, fine." And I began slowly rummaging through my pockets for my phone, wallet, and keys. As soon as I handed them over, I felt the pressure from the blade being lifted as the man behind me stepped backwards. "Don't follow us," the man said very calmly as the two of them walked out the bathroom. Within a few seconds, I heard the sound of my car starting up and ripping out the parking lot along with the other car that they had brought there. I made my way out of the parking lot with nothing to do other than wait and hope that someone stopped by soon. However, help didn't come until around 7 in the morning when a silver van pulled into the rest stop. I gave them a chance to use the bathroom before I asked them for help, but once I explained what happened to them, they were more than happy to let me use their phone and call the police. I waited for the officers to arrive and then I reported the incident. The police told me that they would keep an eye out for my car, but there wasn't much else they could do about it. Thankfully, that ended up being enough though, because less than 2 weeks later, I got a call saying that they found my car and one of the men who stole it from me. And while the other robber is still out there, I know at least one is behind bars at least for the next couple of years. I was in the middle of a road trip with 2 of my friends, and although the trip started out filled with energy, it slowly died out as the night dragged on. However, none of us could see the oncoming nightmare that was about to unfold before us, though looking back on it, it was all highly avoidable. You see, as we continued to drive down the empty stretch of road, I began to slow the car down as I noticed a hitchhiker standing alone on the roadside. We could just barely make out his extended arm and thumb indicating that he was looking for some help, and as we got closer, everyone in the car got quiet. None of us knew whether we should stop and offer him a lift or if we should listen to that feeling in our gut that was telling us it wasn't safe to stop. In the end though, sympathy won, and we pulled over, allowing the hitchhiker to climb in. My friend in the passenger seat decided that he would give the man his seat and sit in the back with our other friend, and the hitchhiker seemed very grateful for it. Sadly, we couldn't seem to shake this feeling of discomfort that seemed to fill the air as soon as the man stepped in. As we began driving down the road, I couldn't help but glance over to the man that we had picked up, and I could see his eyes darting around erratically. The road stretched out before us as the night grew colder as we tried to make small talk, but the hitchhiker started asking some normal questions like where we were from or where we were headed, but eventually he seemed to not want to talk anymore. Silence once again overtook the car. A chill crawled up my spine as we continued to drive on, and as the miles passed, the atmosphere in the car grew increasingly tense. The hitchhiker's behavior became more and more erratic as he began turning the radio on and off and fidgeting with everything in the front seat. When I asked him to please stop messing with everything, his demeanor started to shift. A scowl grew over his face and his eyes locked onto me as if I had offended him. Out of nowhere, the hitchhiker's hand darted toward me, his fingers curling into a claw-like grip. Panic seized me as I fought against his grip. My friends were shouting and begging for him to stop. The car swerved erratically as chaos ensued. In a desperate attempt to escape, I stopped the car and quickly flung open the car door and threw myself out onto the road, my body scraping against the rough asphalt. My heart pounded as I stumbled back onto my feet. I could hear my friends calling out from within the car that had now stopped about 10 feet away from me. The hitchhiker sprang out from the passenger side of the car, and I could see that he had a menacing look on his face as he began to advance toward me. Each step he took filled me with terror, and as he got closer and closer, panic rushed through my body, and I did the only thing I could think of doing. I sprinted as fast as I could in the opposite direction. The wind hitting my face caused my eyes to water more than they already were, and my vision became distorted as I ran from my attacker. All I could do as I ran was hope that I could find help or safety somewhere close. And then, like a single beacon of hope, I saw a roadside diner in the distance. I ran through the parking lot as fast as I could, and I rushed through the doors gasping to catch my breath. My body was trembling, and all of the patrons took notice as they turned their heads to face me. I managed to explain my ordeal between ragged breaths, and they called the police. My friends ended up pulling into the diner shortly before the authorities arrived. They managed to get away from him as he was chasing after me. Once the police arrived, they searched for the hitchhiker. There was a mixture of relief and lingering dread that washed over me. While I was happy that they were doing everything that they could to help, I couldn't help but think that the man who tried to attack me was still out there waiting to make a victim out of someone else. As I drove along that road alone, the only thing that I had to keep my company was the faint glow of the dashboard lights. Sometimes that's all a girl needs though, a car and a road to drive on. Now, had I known that my simple road trip would turn into one of the worst experiences of my life, I probably wouldn't have opted to go by myself. But you never think anything bad is going to happen to you until it actually does. I learned that the hard way as I rounded a bend. Up until that point, I was the only car on the road that night. I hadn't seen headlights in what felt like hours, and then out of nowhere, a car appeared in my rearview mirror. Its headlights were blinding, so I decided to ease over to the side of the road to give them some space, assuming that the driver just wanted to pass me. That didn't seem to be the case though, as instead of passing me, they simply matched the pace of my car. I immediately started to feel uneasy about the situation and glanced over to the car beside me, though the driver was indistinguishable aside from their silhouette. My heart hammered against my chest as the car edged closer to me. At that moment, I knew that I needed to take action before something bad happened to me. I tried slowing down even more, but the car continued to match my pace, almost blocking me up against the side of the road. So that was when I tried to speed up, and to my surprise, the car beside me wasn't able to keep up with me at first. I managed to pull ahead of them a bit and then cut them off to keep them behind me as I accelerated, hoping to create a bit of distance between us. But as my speed increased, so did theirs. My heart was pounding, and my mind was racing with scenarios of what could await me if I didn't find safety. I took an abrupt turn onto a smaller, winding road. My hands trembled on the wheel as I glanced back, hoping to lose my pursuer amidst the darkness. But to my horror, they were still there. The minutes seemed to drag on for hours as I navigated the streets in search of any sort of assistance. I thought about calling the police, but I couldn't find the chance to reach for my phone in my bag. I was trapped in a game of cat and mouse, and I didn't know what to do. That was when an idea popped into my head. I was coming up on a small town, and because I knew that there would be people there, I decided to veer off the highway and into the heart of the town. The streets were empty considering how late it was at night, but I continued to look around for any sort of life. Suddenly, I felt a bit of hope as I spotted a gas station up ahead. I pulled into the parking lot. I threw the car door open and sprinted inside looking for the first person that I could find. I explained what was going on and asked if I could wait there while I called the police, to which the clerk agreed as he locked the door to make sure that we were safe from my pursuer. It didn't take long for us to hear the sound of sirens coming toward the gas station, and as I looked out into the parking lot, I could see the car that had been following me slowly pull out and drive off in the opposite direction. A couple of police officers tried to pursue the driver, but they were unable to stop him. Thankfully though, I made it home safe that night, and though I've experienced road rage incidents since then, nothing has ever been quite as scary as that experience. My friend Kaylin and I worked together for years and had finally accrued enough days off between the two of us to take a small vacation together to a cabin near a lake that my uncle owned. It was a bit of a road trip getting there, but with about a 10-hour drive ahead of us, in June of 2014, we set off on our trip. We left my apartment at around 5 in the morning with hopes of getting to the cabin while it was still daylight out. However, about halfway through our drive, the car started acting up. At first, I thought that it might need some oil or something simple like that, so I had Kaylin look for the nearest place where we could get a quick oil change, and she found one that was close by. There was a small line of cars in front of us, so we ended up sitting for about an hour before finally getting serviced, and then we were back on the road. The car seemed to be holding up fine for a little while after the oil change, and we managed to make it about 40 minutes away from the cabin without another incident. This time though, the problem came when my phone, which we were using for GPS, lost the little bit of signal that it had. We checked Kaylin's phone to see if we could use her GPS app, but she wasn't getting any service either. Now, normally I would have been concerned, but I recognized where we were and I was confident that I could get us to that cabin without it. I continued driving down the road for another 20 minutes or so, and then I saw the small side road that eventually turned into a dirt trail that we would drive down to get to the cabin. As we got closer and closer, I remember getting excited, although I was a little bummed out that it was already starting to get dark, which meant that we would have to wait until the following day to do anything outside. Now, if that was the worst of our issues, it would have been a pretty good vacation. But I'll never forget the sound that the car began making almost as soon as the road transitioned from asphalt to dirt. There was this horrendous grinding sound that started coming from the engine, and then the car slowly came to a stop as smoke began to pour out of the exhaust pipe. I had managed to pull the car to the side of the trail in case any other vehicles needed to pass, but as far as I knew, there were no other cabins or houses out there, so I wasn't sure if we would end up seeing anyone or not. Kaylin and I sat there in silence for a minute before she asked me what we were going to do. I figured that it was getting dark, and since the odds of someone helping us that night seemed unlikely, our best bet would be to walk the last half of a mile to the cabin and hope that we can get that car fixed in the morning. We stepped out of the protection of the car and onto the dirt trail as we made our way toward the trunk to pull out our bags before starting our walk to the cabin. By that point, it was getting a bit hard to see because of how dark it was, but as long as we followed the trail, I knew we'd be fine. I didn't account for anything else that might be lurking in those woods that night. We made it about 20 feet away from the car, and Kaylin suddenly stopped. I looked at her, and before I could ask her what was wrong, I was pretty sure I knew what was freaking her out. In the distance, we could hear the faintest of noises that almost sounded like something moving around among the sticks and twigs. We both focused our attention in the direction that the noise was coming from, and out of the dark appeared a pair of glowing orange eyes. I put my arm out in front of Kaylin and very quietly told her to back up toward the car. We both slowly walked backward with our eyes locked onto the creature in the woods. We managed to take a few steps before we noticed that the eyes in the forest disappeared. We continued walking backward toward our car, and as we reached the front of it, I noticed them again. The orange reflective eyes were now locked back on me, only this time they seemed to be much closer. It was then that I could see that we were locked in a staring contest with a massive looking wolf. And I don't know if you've ever seen a wolf in person, but they're quite a bit bigger than you'd expect. We could hear the quiet sound of it snarling as I reached for the door handle, and once we were both ready, we quickly swung the door open and hopped into the car as fast as we could. Just as I was closing the door behind me, I looked over and saw that the wolf was now standing no more than 2 feet away from my driver's side door. Kaylin and I caught our breath as we tried to figure out what to do. We couldn't call anyone for help because my phone was dead, and there was no way for us to get to the cabin that night. We decided to wait in the car until daylight broke, and then we hoped that the fear would disappear. I'm glad we waited too, because as the night pressed on, one by one more and more pairs of eyes began popping up in the darkness to watch us in our car. It wasn't until around 5 or 6 in the morning that we saw the wolves slowly start to lose interest in us. Even then, we still waited until just before noon to finally make a break for the cabin. We felt much braver in the daylight, but still with each step we took, we half expected to see one of those large beasts chasing us. Thankfully, we made it to the cabin, and the key that my uncle gave me worked just fine. As soon as we were inside, we made sure that the electricity was turned on and searched around for a landline that we could possibly use. Once we found the cabin's phone, we began making calls to see if we could get my car fixed. We didn't spend much time outside the cabin for obvious reasons, but thankfully we were able to get the car towed and fixed at a local shop. Then, after taking a cab to pick up the car, Kaylin and I made our trip back home without any ambition of returning to the woods anytime soon. It was the middle of spring in 2002 when my friend Devin and I were on a road trip back home from visiting family that he had over in Denver. The night air was filled with fog as I drove our car around a long and treacherous-seeming mountain road. The mist was making it hard to see more than a few feet in front of us, and despite the fact that we were driving as slow as we could, we both still gripped our seats as tight as we could during every turn that we made. The tension was heavy around us as the wind continued to howl outside as we drove farther and farther. As the fog slowly turned into heavy rain, the road became noticeably slicker than it was a few moments prior, and it wasn't long before the car began to skid across the soaking wet asphalt. I looked over to Devin to make sure that he was all right, but I saw that he was fixated on the road in front of us. I turned back to focus on the road, but in that second that I looked away, I managed to not make note of the turn coming up ahead. And though we were already going slow, there was no stopping the car entirely. As soon as our tires touched the wet dirt on the edge of the road, it was as if we were ripped off the side of the mountain. Time seemed to slow down as we tumbled through the darkness, the world spinning around us. The sickening thud of metal against rocks echoed through the night, mingling with our screams of terror. Finally, the car stopped moving, and I looked over to Devin to see if he was all right. He seemed conscious, but neither of us could really move much. We looked outside of the shattered windows, and the world that surrounded us seemed devoid of all life. And as I got a closer look at our immediate surroundings, I realized that we were trapped. Our car had gotten lodged on the edge of a mountain, and there was no place for us to go. As time started to pass, the pain from the accident started to radiate through my body, and Devin said he was experiencing similar pains. I personally could feel the weight of bruises forming, the sharp ache of broken bones. Devin was dazed but conscious as he struggled to free himself from the twisted metal that surrounded us. We knew that help wasn't likely to come anytime soon, considering how remote of an area we were in, and very quickly, the reality of our situation started to hit us. Our phones were useless, with mine not getting any service and Devin's being somewhere out of reach. It likely was thrown from the car in the tumble. And with each hour that passed, our isolation from the world became more and more obvious. The night turned to day as time passed, and then day turned back into night. As hunger set in, we scavenged what little supplies we could salvage from the wreckage, rationing what little that we found meticulously. But it was the darkness that really took its toll on us. A second day came and went, and with that night came an eerie silence that was only ever broken by the sharp howl of the wind. As we grew more and more tired, our minds began playing tricks on us. The shadows began to dance, and the trees seemed to twist and morph into different shapes as we became more and more delirious. We clung to the belief that help would eventually arrive, that our ordeal would come to an end. Finally, after 2 agonizing days of waiting, the sound of distant engines reached our ears. I could feel the tears of joy rolling down my face as I caught the first sight of the rescue team that was making their way up the treacherous mountain, and soon after, we saw the helicopter that accompanied them. Tears streamed down our faces as they pulled us to safety, offering warmth, sustenance, and the promise of a return to civilization. The road trip that had begun as a journey of adventure and discovery had transformed into a harrowing fight for survival. The mountain had tested our limits, pushing us to the edge of despair. But thankfully, we both made it out all right.